I once believed that pain would destroy me, but it turned out to be the very thing that taught me how to live again. Early sunlight streamed through the large window, casting a soft, golden hue across the light wooden floor. Inside the small counseling room of the Phoenix Rising Center, there was a gentle quietness, neither too clinical nor too raw, but just enough to let a stranger exhale with ease the moment they walked in. On the opposite wall hung a painting of a phoenix with its wings outstretched in a sky of fire, an image that needed no explanation. Anyone who saw it understood. This was a place of rebirth. Maya Chen sat at a simple wooden desk, wrapped in a light beige cardigan. Her dark brown hair was loosely pinned at the nape of her neck, her face softly made up, her gaze calm and steady. In front of her was a new intake folder, gray cover, a small photograph clipped to the top. The girl in the picture was only 19, and her eyes, caught in the moment of holding on to one last shred of courage, stilled Maya for a few seconds. She had seen many eyes like that before, but every now and then, one of them wasn't just a reminder. It became a mirror, reflecting something back into her own memory. For a brief moment, Maya was no longer a 30-year-old therapist preparing for a session. She was a little girl again, standing in a cold hallway, trying to make sense of why her father kept coughing so much. She set the folder down gently and leaned back in her chair. The room remained as quiet as before, the faint scent of lavender in the air, the soft trickle of a sand timer whispering beside her. But inside her, a door had quietly creaked open. She had known this moment would come, the moment when an old story would demand to be told again, not because the past still haunted her, but because it had become a journey. Maya took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. Her eyes returned to the photo once more. I've stood in that place before. The words echoed clearly in her mind, even if she didn't speak them aloud, and she knew it was time to begin again, from the very place where everything once fell apart. There was a time when Maya's world was small and radiant, like a comic book being flipped through page by the gentle hands of childhood. At that time, she lived in a small house with a red-tiled roof on the outskirts of Seattle, where mornings were always filled with birdsong and the warm scent of pancakes wafting from the kitchen. Her father, Mr. David Chen, was a software engineer, quiet, but always present at the right moments. Every Saturday morning, he wore an apron with a little bear on it and cooked with Maya, the two of them giggling whenever a pancake burned on one side. He taught her how to measure the right amount of batter, to wait until the bubbles rose before flipping the pancake. Maya's earliest life lessons came from mornings like those, simple, consistent, and absorbed into her soul without her even realizing it. Her mother, Mrs. Sarah, was a primary school teacher with a storytelling voice as warm as a fleece blanket in winter. Every night before bed, she would sit beside Maya's bed, read her fairy tales, never forgetting to gently kiss her daughter's forehead before turning off the light. In the dark, Maya would often lie still, listening to her mother's footsteps fading away, feeling her heart fill with something she couldn't quite name, perhaps peace. Her family wasn't rich, but they had one thing in abundance: time for each other. Those camping trips to Mount Rainier, where Maya learned to ride a bike on muddy trails and fell, bruising her knees but still laughing because her father was always behind to catch her. Those summer nights when the whole family laid blankets out in the backyard, looked up at the star-filled sky, listening to her mother talk about the Orion constellation and the silent wishes. In Maya's memory, that world was woven with light, the kind of clear, pure light that only children can feel. It was the feeling of being loved without needing to try, being heard without needing to speak, being completely herself in arms that had never known limits or conditions. She didn't know that light would one day fade, but throughout her journey later on, Maya always remembered that time as a place to hold on to, a true paradise where every pain that came after could be seen through and forgiven. It all started with the coughing. At first, just a few scattered sounds, like the normal reflex of a dry throat after a long day. But then they grew more frequent, deeper, echoing through the night and waking Maya up. She stepped out of her room and saw the kitchen light still on. Her father sitting there, hand covering his mouth, shoulders shaking with every breath. David smiled when he saw her, said it was nothing, just a cold. But Maya noticed her mother's uneasy look as she folded the medical report left on the table, and how doctor visits became a weekly routine. She was only 8. At that age, strange things are just floating question marks. Not enough words to name them, not enough courage to ask. But she could sense something was shifting. Her father's face grew thinner, his eyes darker, and the familiar apron began to be forgotten. One afternoon, after school, her mother picked her up with a forced smile and reddened eyes. That evening, her father sat down between them, his voice quieter than usual. He said he had a lung disease, that it would take a long time to treat. Maya didn't understand it all. She simply nodded, swallowing the tightness in her throat. The months that followed were filled with unfamiliar days. Her father stopped going to work, his hair falling out after each chemo session, his skin turning pale. Yet David tried to keep life steady, still told jokes, still played Uno with Maya, still held her close when she was afraid. Maya never saw her father complain. That made her even more confused and scared, because if he wasn't in pain, then why did her mother cry alone behind closed doors? Once, she stood quietly outside their bedroom, her back against the wall, and heard her mother's choked sobs and a whispered confession like a plea. "I'm scared. I don't know what I'll do if you're gone." That night, Maya lay in bed, clutching her teddy bear, eyes wide open, staring at the dark ceiling. She didn't know what illness meant, let alone death. But deep inside, a quiet fear stirred. Something was falling apart, and no one could stop it. That night, the small house on the quiet street seemed more silent than usual. There was no TV sound echoing from the living room, no soft wind rustling through the curtains. Only the ticking of the clock in the dark, and David's faint breathing, each breath heavy in the stillness of night. Maya sat beside her father's bed, her head resting on his shoulder. She didn't know why her heart was beating so fast, only that something in the air signaled something important was coming. David placed his hand on her back, gently patted it, then slowly turned to look at her. "You have to take care of Mom for me, okay?" That sentence was simple, but it made something in Maya's chest tremble like a taut string. She nodded, not sure she understood everything, but her father's eyes said it all. That night, she fell asleep beside his bed, her hand still loosely holding his. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the window, shining on David's face. Quiet, peaceful, no breath left. Maya called his name a few times. There was no reply. By the time her mother rushed in, everything was already too clear. The funeral took place on a day of drizzling rain. People said the sky was crying too, but Maya didn't. She stood next to her mother, watching the line of people coming to pay respects, her ears ringing with the same condolences repeating like a sad song, with no end. She didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't ask why. Just a numbness spreading inside, as if a part of her had been taken out, and no one had taught her how to fill that space. 3 years later, Maya and her mother lived together in a smaller apartment. Sarah worked 2 jobs a day, always busy, yet still made time to cook for her daughter. On nights when Maya studied, she'd see her mother asleep at the kitchen table, pen still in hand, accounting books open. Life was no longer easy, but love remained, quiet, enduring, never needing to be said aloud. Maya couldn't remember all the hardships of those 3 years. She only remembered that whenever she felt weak, she would look into her mother's eyes, tired but strong, and remind herself to keep going. because that was what her father had once wished for. The summer Maya turned 12, her mother began working evening shifts at a bank branch in the city. At first, Maya didn't pay much attention to her mother's new job. She was already used to seeing Sarah juggle 2 or 3 jobs at once, and Maya herself had gradually become independent, making dinner on her own, studying on her own, doing her own laundry. Until one day, Sarah came home with a different kind of smile. A smile that wasn't tired, wasn't forced like usual. Maya noticed the pink flush on her mother's cheeks, and even the dress she wore was brighter than normal. When asked, Sarah simply said there was a new coworker who was very kind, often brought pastries for everyone during breaks. The name Robert Thompson came up for the first time during that dinner. Chief accountant of the branch, recently divorced, 2 grown children who lived with his ex-wife. Sarah said he had a polite demeanor, a deep voice, and was especially charming in conversation. Then, by the weekend, Sarah announced she was going out for dinner. A rare statement from someone who usually gave all her time to work and her daughter. Maya stood by the window, watching her mother's figure disappear down the street, feeling a strange sensation inside. Not jealousy, not exactly worry, just a vague confusion at seeing her mother begin to change. A few days later, Robert came to visit. He brought a stack of children's books, a box of chocolates, and a warm, deep voice. Maya, in the shyness of a growing girl, only nodded in greeting. Robert wasn't overly friendly, didn't try too hard to make conversation, but his eyes always seemed to scan everything, from the color of her shirt to the family photo hanging in the living room. Sarah, meanwhile, looked radiant in a way Maya hadn't seen in a long time. She saw her mother laughing a lot, and for the first time in 3 years, music played during dinner in their small home. After that first evening, Robert became a familiar presence in their small home. At first, it was short phone calls at the end of the day, then picking Sarah up after work, and before long, he was joining most of their weekend dinners. Sarah seemed to come alive again, as if shedding years of fatigue. She laughed more, hummed tunes while cooking, and even started wearing a soft pink lipstick in the mornings. Maya would watch her mother fix her hair in the mirror, feeling a mix of curiosity and unfamiliar warmth. She wasn't used to having a man around, but it was hard to deny her mother's newfound joy. Robert presented himself as the ideal gentleman. He took them out to restaurants, planned weekend picnics, and even gifted Maya a brand new backpack before the school year started, along with a warm, "Do well, little princess." Maya smiled politely, though she kept a quiet distance in her heart. One afternoon, after a short trip to the coast, Sarah laughed and said how relieved she felt not having to worry so much about money. Robert gently reached for her hand and replied, "I could help you manage it if you'd like." Just a little, just enough to ease the pressure. Sarah hesitated briefly, then nodded. Soon after, subtle suggestions began to surface. Remarks about how Sarah might want to avoid being too friendly with male colleagues, or that she should consider dressing more modestly at the bank. Robert never raised his voice, never scolded. It was always just a glance, a slight furrow of the brow, or a soft-spoken line. "I just want what's best for you." Maya didn't fully understand the changes. She was still too young to see the difference between care and control. All she knew was that her mother smiled a little less, and that a few extra seconds of silence had crept into their dinner table conversations. They got married on a cloudy Sunday, just after Maya turned 13. The ceremony was simple, attended only by a few of Robert's relatives and a couple of Sarah's co-workers. There were no classmates, no neighbors, and no one from Maya's father's side. Everything felt compact, quiet, proper, yet strangely devoid of warmth. Maya wore a pale floral dress and stood silently beside her mother during the brief exchange of vows. Robert, in a gray suit, looked pleased as he slipped the ring onto Sarah's finger. Maya couldn't remember if she smiled. All she knew was that when glasses clinked in celebration, she felt like an outsider in a story she didn't belong to. Right after the wedding, they moved into Robert's house, a spacious, orderly place that felt cold and unfamiliar. There were no old photographs, none of the familiar items from their previous home. Everything was neatly arranged, almost sterile. Robert wasted no time laying out the new house rules. Dinner would be at a fixed hour, no television during rest time, and absolutely no mess allowed. He didn't like children talking too much when adults are eating. At first, Sarah tried to soften his words, offering quiet explanations to Maya, but over time, even she grew quieter. Maya began to sense something unnamed shifting in the air. Robert never raised his voice at her, but whenever Sarah wasn't looking, his gaze felt cold, piercing in a way that made her instinctively shrink back. One time, she accidentally spilled a glass of water on the table. Robert didn't say a word. He just stared, but the silence felt heavier than any scolding. She didn't know what to call that feeling. All she knew was that in this new house, her mother's laughter became rare, and Maya herself began to walk softer, speak less, and watch closely for any change in the man she was now expected to call Stepfather. It all happened gradually, so quietly that if you weren't paying close attention, you might not notice it changing at all. At first, it was just offhand comments about Sarah's friends, that they complained too much, that they weren't truly supportive, that they were jealous of how happy she had become. Robert said these things in a gentle voice, while pouring tea or sitting beside her on the couch, as if it came from a place of concern. Soon, Sarah started turning down invitations. Phone calls grew less frequent. Maya would overhear her mother saying to someone on the line, "I'm just too busy lately. Maybe another time." Then came the silent headshakes, the unanswered texts. Sarah's bank account was merged with Robert's for easier management. He worked in finance, and according to him, it was better for the family's long-term stability. Every expense was logged meticulously, and Sarah had to check in before purchasing anything beyond basic necessities. At first, she tried to smile and explain to Maya that this was just a more frugal way of living. But Maya noticed something hesitate in her mother's eyes every time she opened her wallet, like even she needed permission. The new dress Sarah had planned to wear to a close friend's wedding was folded up and quietly stored away, never to be mentioned again. Conversations between Sarah and Maya became more cautious. Not because of lost affection, but because it always felt like someone was listening. Robert had a way of entering rooms just as they were talking, standing silently for a few seconds, as if by accident, then asking something completely unrelated. Maya didn't have the words for any of it at the time, but one thing was clear. Her mother was slowly disappearing. Not in body, but in presence, in the voice, the lightness, the freedom that once made Maya feel safe. Now, all of that seemed to be fading, bit by bit, without a sound. After the subtle shifts came the establishment of clear, unyielding rules. Robert began imposing strict schedules for every aspect of the household. Dinner was at 6 sharp, never early, never late. The living room lights had to be off by 10, and no one was allowed to open the fridge after dinner without his permission. Sarah was expected to report her daily schedule each morning, where she would go, who she'd meet, how long she'd be out. Upon returning, she had to recount every stop, every purchase. At first, she tried to speak in a calm, even tone, but over time, her words grew clipped, hesitant, like someone rehearsing a report she didn't want to get wrong. Even her clothing came under quiet scrutiny. Robert suggested that as a married woman, she should dress more modestly, more appropriately. The soft floral dresses were gradually replaced by buttoned shirts and dark slacks. Sarah never objected. She simply folded her favorite outfits and tucked them deep into the back of the closet, hiding a version of herself that no longer felt welcome. Maya watched it all unfold in silence. She didn't ask her mother questions like she used to. Instead, she studied everything: how Robert buttoned his shirt, where he placed his keys, the slight crease in his brow whenever Sarah said something he didn't quite approve of. Dinner became the most tense hour of the day. Robert sat at the head of the table, eating slowly, asking questions like a man conducting an audit. Sarah had to account for her day, each call made, each trip to the market. Maya kept her answers short, precise, and never asked questions in return. She developed an odd skill, reading Robert's mood from the sound of his car door. If it slammed shut, she'd retreat to her room immediately. If it closed softly, she might step into the living room, but never without caution. The first time Robert raised his voice was over a dinner served 10 minutes late. He stood up abruptly, his voice sharp and accusing. Sarah froze. She didn't argue. She simply whispered, "I'm sorry," in a voice that no longer carried confidence, only guilt, quiet and deep. That evening began like so many others. Maya was in her room, working through math problems, ears tuned to the soft clinking of utensils downstairs. There was a rigid kind of silence in the house, the kind that made every sound hesitate before breaking the stillness. Robert came home late, reeking of alcohol, his heavy steps thudding up the wooden stairs. Maya froze mid-sentence. She heard the kitchen door swing open, then his voice, low but laced with irritation that throbbed under every word. He accused Sarah of smiling too much at the male cashier at the bank. Maya couldn't make out her mother's reply, only the sharp clatter of dishes against the table. Their voices grew quicker, sharper, cutting across each other like blades. Then suddenly, a loud crash, like something breaking on the floor. Maya stood up, moved toward her door, her hands trembling. She pressed her ear against the wood, heart racing, chest tightening with dread. In the brief silence after the crash, she heard Sarah's breath, quick and shaky, then a strained voice. "Please, don't." No one called Maya downstairs, but she knew not to go. She returned to her desk, trying to sit still as if nothing had happened, but the echo of what she'd heard wouldn't leave her mind. She knew something had crossed a line. No longer just harsh words, but something deeper, darker. The next morning, Sarah wore a long-sleeved blouse, even though the weather was warm. When Maya caught a glimpse of the bruise peeking out from under the cuff, she didn't ask. Her mother simply offered a forced smile and said, "I tripped on the stairs, that's all." That afternoon, Robert brought home flowers, a large, bright bouquet placed neatly at the center of the dining table. He kissed Sarah on the forehead and apologized with practiced softness. Maya sat across from them, watching her mother nod quietly, eyes red but dry. And in that moment, Maya understood. This house was no longer a safe place. After that night, Maya began living in a constant state of alert. No one spoke openly about what had happened. There were no conversations, no explanations, just a shift in the air, heavier and more stifling, as if every sound echoed inside a room with no exit. Each afternoon, as Robert's car pulled up to the curb, Maya held her breath, waiting to hear the sound of the car door. If it slammed, sharp and heavy, she'd retreat to her room, pretending to study or slipping on headphones, even if they weren't playing anything. If it closed softly, she could breathe a little easier, though never completely. Sarah changed too. She no longer made small talk during dinner, only passed dishes and nodded. Mother and daughter learned to communicate with glances, brief but clear looks that said, "Stay quiet, be careful, don't provoke him." Maya gradually mastered the art of disappearing. She stayed late after school, claiming club meetings or group projects. At home, she moved quietly, spoke only when necessary, and never opened the fridge if Robert was nearby. One evening, Sarah was scolded for forgetting to prepare Robert's favorite dish. Maya sat at the table, gripping her fork tightly, watching her mother's face. It wasn't curiosity, it was survival. She needed to read every reaction, to learn what to avoid, how to step back before things escalated. The house was no longer a home. It had become a maze where every step had to be measured, every breath taken just carefully enough to go unnoticed. And at 14, Maya had learned her first lesson as someone trying to survive. You had to sense the storm while it was still a breeze. You had to learn how to walk on eggshells without breaking a single one. Peaceful nights became rare in that house. Robert began drinking more frequently. At first, it was just a few drinks after dinner, but soon, he was already intoxicated before he even stepped through the door. Maya could tell, just by the sound of his keys, when they fumbled too long in the lock. She knew to quietly lock her bedroom door. The shouting usually came late at night, long after everyone was supposed to be asleep. Arguments Maya never saw, only heard: shattering glass, chairs scraped harshly across the floor, her mother's muffled sobs behind thin walls. She often crawled into her closet, clutching a pillow to her chest, hands over her ears, but the sounds still found their way in like tiny needles. Sarah never spoke of it. The next morning, she would wake early, make breakfast, and call Maya to the table with a voice carefully held together. She wore long sleeves, sunglasses when she went out, and told neighbors she hadn't been sleeping well, that work had been exhausting. Maya didn't ask, but her eyes searched for clues. A bruise on the wrist, a limp in her mother's walk. Even at her age, Maya understood that her mother was trying to protect her in the only way she knew how. Silence. But it was that very silence that made it so hard to breathe. One night, Maya held the phone in her hand, her thumb hovering over 911. She was ready. She wanted to do it. But then she heard her mother's voice outside her door. Soft, steady, like a lullaby meant to reassure. "It's okay, honey. Go to sleep." And once again, Maya put the phone down. From then on, school became her lifeline. She poured herself into books, grades, exams, always at the top of her class. Because somewhere deep inside, she believed that if she were smart enough, strong enough, then one day, she could lead her mother out of this place. School became the only place where Maya felt like she mattered. There, no one looked at her as if she were hiding something. No one asked questions that forced her to choose between truth and silence. There were just words, numbers, and exams, things she could control, things she could master with effort. Unlike other girls her age, Maya didn't seek out friendships. Instead, she found solace in the library, a quiet haven where, by the age of 15, she was already reading Freud, Carl Jung, and Viktor Frankl. She didn't fully understand everything, but there was something in those pages that made her feel less alone. That others, too, had walked through darkness and tried to make sense of it. One day, she submitted an essay titled, "Why Do People Hurt the Ones They Love?" Her literature teacher, Ms. Ramirez, kept her after class. She didn't pry or ask personal questions. She simply said, "You have a rare ability to tap into something real. You should study psychology." That night, Maya lay awake, replaying the sentence in her mind like a quiet prophecy. In her final year of high school, Maya received a full scholarship to the University of Washington, majoring in psychology. When the acceptance letter arrived, she didn't scream, didn't cry. She just stood still, then looked toward her mother, who was washing dishes in the kitchen, and softly said, "I got in." Sarah didn't rush to embrace her, didn't offer grand words. She simply looked at her daughter for a long moment, then nodded, her eyes glassy. "I knew you would." The night before Maya left for college, Sarah handed her a small envelope. Inside was a modest amount, just a few $100s, but Maya knew it was everything her mother had quietly saved over the years. "For you," Sarah said, her voice low, almost trembling. "To start something new." Then she turned away quickly. Maya held the envelope tightly in her hands, as if it were a promise, not just of a future, but of survival. A quiet agreement between mother and daughter that someday, beyond all this, there would be light. The day Maya moved into her dorm, the Seattle sky was gently lit by a soft autumn sun. Her old suitcase sat neatly beside the new bed, a small, tidy room with pale blue sheets and a window that opened to rows of trees turning golden. For the first time in her life, Maya had a space that was entirely her own. No one listening outside the door, no one monitoring her movements, no need to shrink her voice or second-guess the sound of her footsteps. She stood in the center of the room, doing nothing, just breathing, deep, unguarded breaths, soaking in a kind of quiet that didn't feel forced, the quiet of freedom. The first week passed like a slow dream. Maya adjusted to class schedules, learned the layout of the campus buildings, figured out how to borrow books from the library, and how to order coffee at the little corner cafe. Everything felt dizzyingly new, yet comforting in a way that made her wonder if the world had always been like this, and she had only now stepped into it. She began studying trauma psychology, how the brain adapts to violence, how silence becomes a survival mechanism. There were lectures that made her put down her pen, not out of confusion, but because the words mirrored her life so precisely. She would sit there quietly, a realization slowly breaking open inside her. What had haunted her all these years wasn't strange or shameful. It had a name, it had a cause, and most importantly, it could be understood and healed. For the first time, Maya made real friends. There was no need to lie about her family, no pressure to fake smiles. Her classmates didn't pry, didn't try to fix her. They simply showed up, shared lunches, studied together, laughed at small things that made long days lighter. Sometimes, Maya called home. Her mother's voice on the other end sounded softer, farther away, like the distance between them wasn't just physical. Sarah was okay, still working, still asking how Maya was doing, but something in her tone felt like a slowly fading photograph. After each call, guilt crept in. Freedom came with its own weight. Maya was living a life her mother never got to have, while Sarah remained behind, in the same house, with the same man neither of them had ever dared to name out loud. But even through that guilt, Maya understood something else. She couldn't go back and pull her mother out. Not yet. She had to keep going, had to grow stronger, not just for herself, but so that one day she could return and bring her mother into the light too. They met in the library on a drizzly afternoon. Maya was standing between two shelves, flipping through a thick psychology textbook for her clinical psych paper, when a low, slightly hoarse voice came from the other side of the shelf. "You're looking for that one too, huh?" She looked up. A tall, slender guy stood there, soft curls, warm brown eyes that seemed to have seen a lot but weren't in a rush to explain any of it. He smiled, holding out the very book she'd been reaching for. "Lucky for us, only one of us needs it right now." His name was Alex Rivera, a senior majoring in fine arts. He painted murals on weekends and worked part-time at a small gallery downtown. Maya learned these details over time, first through chance encounters, then through short conversations while they studied in the same corner of the library, and eventually, long walks around campus after class. At first, Maya kept her guard up. She was used to maintaining distance, to relationships that never asked too much or got too close. But Alex never pushed. He didn't pry, didn't pressure her to open up. He was simply present. A warm cup of tea left beside her study spot, an umbrella offered when the sky broke open, a quiet message. "Did you get back okay?" That quiet consistency wore down her walls, gently. She began sharing little things. Her habit of organizing books by color, her preference for writing in 3 different ink colors, her unease with the sound of doors slamming. Alex never interrupted, never tried to solve anything. He just listened and stayed. One winter evening, Maya opened up about her childhood. Fragmented, disjointed pieces, not the whole story. Alex didn't ask for more. He simply took her hand and said, "You don't have to explain everything. I just want you to know, I'm not going anywhere." It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was the first time Maya felt chosen, not out of pity, but for who she truly was, with all the cracks and quietness she carried. Love didn't arrive in a storm. It came like a gentle mist, soft, steady, soaking into the fractured parts of her without making a sound. And slowly, Maya began to learn what love could look like when it didn't require shrinking yourself to feel safe. She graduated with honors. Instead of going home, Maya rented a small apartment near campus to begin her master's program. The space was simple: a desk, a shelf, a window that caught the sunrise. No grandeur, no extravagance, but for the first time in her life, she felt safe. And for the first time, Maya could call a place home, without hesitation, without fear. Her 22nd birthday arrived quietly, without fuss. Alex had planned ahead: a simple dinner, a few candles, a small cake, and soft jazz playing from a Bluetooth speaker perched on the windowsill. Maya's apartment was modest, but warm, just enough space for the two of them to sit beneath the golden glow of dim lights, sharing a glass of red wine and unhurried conversation. She sat cross-legged on the carpet, wearing her favorite gray sweater, a softness in her posture that matched the quiet joy on her face. It wasn't the gifts or greetings that made the night special. It was the feeling of being safe, of being with someone who never asked her to shrink or pretend. Alex handed her a painting he had made himself, a portrait of Maya sitting by the window, light falling gently across her cheek, eyes drifting towards something far away. "You're the strongest person I know," he said softly. Maya didn't answer. She only squeezed his hand gently, letting silence speak for her. It could have been a perfect night. She hadn't expected more. Peace was enough, simple, steady, and free of shadows. But at 10:30 p.m., her phone rang. An unknown number. She stared at the screen. No name, no message, just a missed call, then another, and another. A quiet unease crept in like a cold draft under the door. Alex noticed the shift in her face, but Maya simply shook her head. "Probably a wrong number," she said, placing the phone face down on the table, her voice trying to sound steady. But inside her, small waves had already begun to rise. She didn't know why, only that something felt off. Less than an hour later, there was a knock at the door. Loud, heavy, repeating, like fists pounding through the quiet. Maya stood up in an instant, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. Through the window, she could make out two figures. One of them was her mother. The other, eyes bloodshot, voice she never wanted to hear again, was Robert. The knocking turned into pounding. At first, it came in uneven bursts, but then it grew steady, relentless, like a heartbeat coming undone in Maya's chest. Each blow against the door struck at the memories she had worked so hard to bury. She stepped closer, heart hammering, hands trembling as she peered through the peephole. Robert. His silver hair clung to his forehead, soaked by rain. His eyes were bloodshot, his breath visible in the cold, like waves of alcohol pouring into the night. Behind him stood Sarah, her mother, drenched, terrified, her trembling hands clutching at his arm, as if trying to restrain what she could no longer control. "Open the door! I know you're in there!" His voice cut through the hallway like a blade. Maya stepped back, gripping her phone. Alex stood behind her, confused and wide-eyed. "Call 911, she whispered, her voice tight but steady. While Alex dialed, Maya fought to keep her breathing calm, reading out the address slowly, eyes locked on the door as if the moment she looked away, it might collapse. Outside, the sound of boots scraping the concrete echoed louder. Robert growled, "You think hiding here makes you safe? You're my daughter, you hear me?" Each word landed like a blow to her ribs, each syllable stirring up every wound she had tried to forget. But this time, she was no longer a child. Sarah's voice tried to cut through the chaos, soaked in tears and rain. "Robert, please. She didn't do anything wrong. Let's just go home." "Shut up!" he roared, turning and slamming his foot against the door. The wood cracked, loud, splintering. Alex pulled Maya back, his hand on her shoulder as if trying to anchor her. For a moment, it felt like everything she had run from came rushing back in. The long sleeves her mother used to wear, the sharp slam of a car door, the thick stench of liquor, the breathless silence between outbursts. She had thought she'd escaped, thought she'd rebuilt her life. But the old monster had found its way to her doorstep, The door burst open with a heavy thud, as if time itself had collapsed in its wake. Robert stormed in without hesitation, like fury long imprisoned now erupting into a room thick with fear. Maya instinctively stepped back, her foot catching the edge of the table, but she didn't stop. She turned and ran toward the bedroom, hoping to lock the door, hoping to call for help. But Robert was faster. His hand clutched her hair and yanked her backward. Maya screamed, not from pain, but from the helplessness rising up from somewhere deep inside her. "You really thought you could get away?" he roared, his voice hoarse with alcohol and hate. "I'm your father!" The sound of objects clattering to the floor, Alex's stumbling footsteps trying to intervene, Sarah's sobs in the background. It all blended into a warped symphony of panic. Alex threw himself between them, trying to pull Robert away, but was shoved hard and slammed into the wall. The impact left him dazed, blood trickling from his forehead. He struggled to rise, but his limbs wouldn't obey. From the floor, Alex could only cry out Maya's name in desperation. Maya thrashed, trying to escape, but was shoved again. Her back struck the corner of the table with a sharp, solid thump. A searing pain shot down her spine. The next blow came from a place far darker than mere physical rage. It wasn't just violence, it was years of suppression breaking loose. Maya heard a crack deep inside her. She couldn't tell if it was a bone or something deeper. Sarah screamed, "Robert, stop! That's your daughter!" But she didn't move closer. She just stood there, eyes torn, tears falling, feet frozen to the floor. Maya looked at her mother through blurred vision and pain. Her gaze no longer asked, why? There was only one thing left: despair. The final kick landed in her ribs. She coughed up blood. Everything dimmed. The lights, the sounds, even her sense of gravity. Only one thought echoed in her mind. I won't fall here. I've come too far to be swallowed by the dark again. Maya lay motionless on the cold tile floor, her breath shallow and broken, eyes half closed like a door slowly shutting in the middle of a storm. She could feel warmth seeping from her chest. Was it blood, or had the pain finally reached her heart? Her body felt shattered. The boundary between physical agony and emotional numbness blurred into one indistinguishable mass. Everything around her faded into distance, into the haze of a dream about to dissolve. In that moment, a distant siren pierced the thick air, howling through the silence like a blade. The sound was both terrifying and hopeful, a hand reaching out from the abyss. It slowed Maya's heartbeat, offering a strange and tender sense of comfort. Robert, still panting amid the chaos, flinched at the noise. He turned toward the door like a wild animal sensing the hunter's approach. Without a word, he bolted, leaving behind a wrecked room and a smeared trail of blood on the floor. Sarah collapsed beside Maya, her trembling fingers searching for signs of life on her daughter's battered face. "Maya, my baby, I'm so sorry." Her voice broke into sobs, each word carrying years of regret that had never been spoken. She clutched her daughter's limp body, gripping her hand as if afraid it might slip away forever. Maya tried to open her eyes, but could only make out the tear-streaked blur of her mother's face, and a faint light flickering beyond the window. Perhaps from a police car, or maybe from something else within her that had just awakened. She had no strength left to speak, nor any fear remaining. Only a gentle emptiness remained, as if, finally, someone was holding her. In the arms of the mother she once believed had gone silent forever, Maya drifted away. No more pain, no more tears, only one last breath. And then she vanished into the dark. Maya awoke under a cold, white light, the kind that made her feel suspended between life and death. The room was suffocatingly still. Only the steady beeping of the heart monitor broke the silence, mingling with the sharp scent of antiseptic hanging in the air. She blinked slowly, turning her head with effort. Each movement sent a wave of pain shooting up her spine, The hospital room blurred before her eyes. Alex was sitting beside her, head bowed, his face drawn with exhaustion. Yet he held her hand tightly, as if afraid that if he let go, she would disappear back into the nightmare. His hair was messy, dark circles carved beneath his eyes, and the panic still lingering on his face told Maya all she needed to know. He hadn't left her side for hours, maybe days. On the other side of the bed, Sarah sat like a statue. But the moment Maya stirred, she jolted forward, rushing over. Her trembling hands reached for her daughter's face, and her lips repeated again and again, "Maya, I'm here. I'm so sorry. I'm here now." The dizziness hadn't fully faded, but fragments of memory began to return. Robert's iron grip, her mother's sobs, the sirens in the distance, the door bursting open. A doctor entered the room, his voice soft and careful, as if afraid to disturb something fragile. "You suffered a mild concussion, a fractured collarbone, and 3 cracked ribs. Fortunately, there's no serious internal injury." Maya didn't respond. She simply nodded, like all the pain in her body was still lighter than the break inside her soul. Sarah gripped her hand, this time without letting go. She lowered her head, and tears fell quietly onto the white hospital sheet. "I called the police. Robert's been arrested, sweetheart." Maya closed her eyes, and in the midst of pain, something still and gentle spread through her chest, an unfamiliar calm. For the first time, she didn't feel like she had to fight alone. And maybe, just maybe, a new life had begun. The following weeks passed by in an oddly slow rhythm. Maya remained in the hospital for observation and physical therapy, while the world outside kept turning, a world she knew she had to face, even as her body still ached and her mind wasn't ready. On the day of the trial, Maya was brought in by wheelchair. She sat in the back row, beneath the sterile courtroom lights, surrounded by strangers' curious, judging stares. Sarah took the witness stand, a small, trembling figure, hands clenched tightly, voice raw from anxiety. But for the first time in years, she spoke the truth. She told them about the nights locked in a room, about the paychecks taken from her hands, about the slaps that came with apologies and fresh flowers the next morning. She confessed to everything, the fear, the silence, and the deep shame of failing to protect her daughter. Across the room, Robert sat stone-faced, occasionally curling his lips into a mocking smirk. But this time, the smirk meant nothing. This time, there were records. There was evidence. There were witnesses. The crime could not be denied. At the end of the trial, the verdict was delivered: 18 years in prison. No one clapped, no one cheered. There was only a heavy silence, like the closing of a nightmare that had dragged on for far too long. Maya felt something lift from her chest, but it wasn't relief. It was emptiness. Because when the monster disappears, what remains is ruin, grief, and ash. Sarah stepped down and walked to Maya. "I signed the divorce papers. I'm starting therapy too. I'm not going to back down again." Maya looked at her mother, said nothing, only reached out her hand. For the first time, she held her mother's hand without fear. They were still wounded, still facing a long, uncertain road. But this time, they would walk it together. The following spring, Maya returned to the university. Her back still wasn't fully straight, but every step she took carried a new resolve, a longing to be understood, to be healed, and to pass on the light to those still lost in the same darkness she once knew intimately. She chose to specialize in trauma therapy and domestic violence, not just because of her past, but because she believed that if she had survived the fire, then maybe, just maybe, she could help others walk through it too. The early sessions of therapy were a battlefield. Maya had learned how to tell other people's stories, but telling her own, with her real voice, with real tears, was something else entirely. The rage that had lived quietly inside her for years finally surged to the surface. Not aimed at Robert, but at the woman who had stood silent in that room years ago. "I called out to you, Mom. You saw everything. Why didn't you do anything?" There was no easy answer to that question, but Sarah didn't run. She listened, she endured, and eventually she broke down too. "Because I was scared, because I was weak, but I don't want to hide anymore." The bond between mother and daughter, once shattered, was now being mended slowly, with apologies, with long conversations, with honest hand-holding, and with joint therapy sessions, where they sat face to face with the pain they no longer pretended to ignore. Sarah started working again, just a small job at the local library, a quiet place where she met women who had once been just like her. She was no longer the silent woman. She was someone learning to say no, learning to stand tall and say, "I survived." And as for Maya, she continued writing her thesis. But deep down, she knew she was writing something far bigger. A new chapter in her journey of rebuilding from the ashes. 2 years later, on an early autumn morning, sunlight streamed through the windows of Phoenix Rising Center, casting soft, golden ribbons across the floor, like hands gently caressing old wounds. What once was a rented room with white walls and 2 wooden chairs had now become a full-fledged trauma center. 5 counseling rooms, a small relaxation space, and a quiet library for survivors. The name Phoenix Rising wasn't poetic flourish. It was a declaration that from ashes, people could rise again. Maya had chosen it on a night full of tears and courage, when she decided to turn her pain into purpose. Now, every passing day, she witnessed stories that mirrored her own shattered memories. Women with trembling voices, children who flinched at sudden sounds, eyes that hadn't slept in years. She didn't heal them. She simply stood beside them, like a mirror that reflected back the truth. Survival is possible. Sarah now worked at the front desk. No longer the shadowed woman behind a domineering man, she had become the first light greeting each visitor. With a gentle voice and a gaze free of judgment, she would say to each one, "I'm here. You're not alone." That day, Maya prepared to meet a new client, a 19-year-old girl, thin and silent, hands clenched tightly in her lap, like holding on to something barely left. She sat across from Maya, saying nothing. Only her eyes spoke, guarded and sharp, like a small animal just escaped the fire. Maya didn't rush. She met the girl's gaze and spoke in a calm voice, steady as the earth. "You're safe now. Here, no one can hurt you anymore." In that moment, a tiny crack appeared in the girl's frozen shell, and Maya knew the journey had begun again. Not from the start, but from the very place where the pain had rooted itself the deepest. Outside the window, the sun kept rising. A single autumn leaf drifted to the porch, light as the first breath of a new life.